My name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle, and this will be a message on Genesis chapter 1, creation theology as a foundation for the Christian worldview. So let's read the text to get us started. Genesis begins, the Bible itself begins with these words. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. There was evening, and there was morning, the first day. Thus begins the Bible. And this doctrine of creation lays the foundation for the biblical worldview. Now, one of the first things that this creation account asserts is that God exists. In the beginning, God. And Genesis assumes the existence of God rather than arguing for it. But it already begins to give us some information that would be useful in making an argument for the existence of God. Creation, indeed, itself shows that God exists. You can take the fact that the world had a beginning and argue from that God exists. William Lane Craig argued it this way. Whatever begins to exist has a cause of its coming to exist. The universe began to exist. This is accepted by secular people today since the Hubble telescope proved that the steady state universe that many in the early 20th century argued for was invalid, that the earth wasn't always a steady state, but rather has a beginning, which they call the Big Bang. Well, that has shown that the universe actually has a beginning. Well, whatever begins to exist has a cause of its coming to exist. The universe began to exist, and therefore the universe has a cause. And we would argue from a Christian worldview that that cause is God. Or you could use another argument known as the teleological argument. All designs imply a designer. And when you look at the world, there seems to be a great design in the universe, and therefore there must be a great designer in the universe. Back in the 19th century, a theologian named Behe illustrated this with a watchmaker analogy. If one discovered a watch, well, that would imply a watchmaker. And thus, design in nature implies that there must be a designer. In modern times, this argument has been adopted and developed by the what's called the Intelligent Design movement. One of the defenders of that movement is a fellow named Michael Behe, a molecular biologist. And he argued in a book called Darwin's Black Box back in 1996 that many things in biology are irreducibly complex and could not have evolved by natural selection. He gives many examples, even on the level of microbiology, that would be too complex for me to discuss. But one of the more understandable examples is the human eye. Individual elements of the eye do not have a logical way of randomly evolving. Unless all the parts of the eye simultaneously came into existence, you need a retina, you need a lens, you need an optic nerve. If you didn't have all of those things at once, the eye couldn't function. It would not benefit a precursor organism just to have a retina or a lens if the other parts are lacking. In other words, the human eye could not have evolved one small step at a time in a piecemeal kind of manner by which natural selection supposedly works. They would be as useless, indeed, they would be useless and detrimental for survival as individual elements before all of them came together to form a functioning eye. Behe likes to use the mousetrap analogy. Mousetrap is a simple device, but it's actually pretty complex in its own way. Without a platform, a spring, and a trigger mechanism, it would be useless. It is irreducibly complex. And so if you can imagine evolution evolving a platform, but without the spring and the trigger mechanism, well, it wouldn't function as a mousetrap. Or if you had a spring and a trigger mechanism, but not a platform to put it on, well, it would be useless. And many things in biology are irreducibly complex, which implies, again, the existence of a designer that put these things together in a way that they function as a system. And again, chance evolution doesn't seem to explain that very well. By the way, Behe would be a theistic evolutionist. He believed that evolution occurs, but he believes that it's guided by God. Well, let's just go back to the Bible itself. If you just had these early verses in the Bible, we'll say Genesis chapter 1 as a whole, what would it tell us about God? And of course, we've already mentioned that it tells us that God exists. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But it also tells us that he is the creator. And as creator, that also tells us something about God. It would take a pretty powerful God to create the entire world. You might use the fancy theological word omnipotence, since only an all-powerful God would be able to create the vast universe. On the other hand, being all-powerful is not enough to create a universe. If I were all-powerful, I couldn't create the world because I frankly wouldn't have any idea how to do it. I might have the power to do it if I just had the know-how to do it. But this implies that God is infinitely wise. He did have the know-how to create the entire universe. And so God exists. God is all-powerful. God is infinitely wise. Another thing it shows in chapter 1 of Genesis, that God is separate from creation. Now, at the time that the Bible was written, many people were polytheists. They believed in many gods. And typically, pagans that believed in many gods believed that the sun and the moon and the stars were all individually gods. So in Mesopotamia, for example, in biblical times, the sun was the god Shamash. The moon was the god Sin. And various stars were considered gods as well. There's also a philosophy known as pantheism that says that everything that is God. In other words, God is the world. And some environmentalist activists have been functioning pantheists, essentially worshiping nature as the goddess Gaia, named after the Greek goddess of earth. When people speak of Mother Nature, they're using the language of pantheism. Well, if you ever saw the original movie Avatar, built into that movie is a worldview of pantheistic theology, viewing the world and indeed worshiping the world as divine. But contrary to pantheism, Genesis 1 clearly distinguishes God from the things that he created. God made the world, but God is not the world. And contrary to polytheism, the sun and the moon and the stars are merely objects made by God and not gods. We also find in Genesis a hint of the doctrine of the Trinity. In verse 2, it speaks about the Spirit of God moving or hovering, translations vary, upon the face of the waters. Well, there's God who created the heavens and the earth, but then there's the Spirit of God, which is related, but slightly different way of putting it. And then in verse 26, when it speaks about the creation of man, the text says that God said, "Let us make man in our own image." Let us make man. Now, what's this us? And Christian theologians have argued that these things are hints of the doctrine found elsewhere in the Bible, especially in the New Testament, the doctrine of the Trinity, that God, there's only one God, but that one true God exists in three persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Now, while this is not spelled out in Genesis or even in the Old Testament as a whole, verses like these in Genesis chapter 1 give us little hints that that might be a valid doctrine. So the first thing that Genesis 1 teaches us is that God exists, as something about what God is like. The second thing that Genesis 1 teaches us is that creation is designed by God's wisdom and subject to his laws. Creation is designed by God's wisdom and subject to his laws. And particularly other parts of Scripture that reflect on Genesis 1 bring this out more clearly. For example, in Psalm 104 and verse 24, it comments, "How many are your works, Lord? In wisdom you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures." It speaks of the wisdom that God used in making the world. And Jeremiah 10 and verse 12, "But God made the earth by his power. He founded the world by his wisdom and stretched out the heavens by his understanding." Jeremiah 10 and verse 12. Now, the worldview that's being laid out in Genesis 1 is rather different than the worldview of atheistic materialism. Secular materialists or atheists see no design or wisdom in creation. They see the universe as a product of godless evolution, the impersonal universe plus time plus chance, and nothing else. To them, the world lacks a designer, and life lacks objective purpose. Life itself is ultimately meaningless. We humans are merely accidental byproducts of evolution and doomed to perish both individually and as a species. Even the universe itself will perish, as all the stars will eventually burn out, leaving the universe dead, cold, dark, and lifeless. The Christian worldview is radically different. We see the world as designed by God and reflecting his wisdom, and that man is made by the infinite personal God, and that man's purpose and man can find meaning by following God's guidance in this life and fulfilling the purposes for which God has designed us. And we can even see how God has a plan for human beings eternally. Our fate is not extinction. Our state is an eternal presence in the presence of God. You can also see how God builds his laws into nature and his wisdom into nature. David Nagel wrote this some years ago. "All realms of reality, physical, moral, spiritual, cultural, have a certain divinely ordained structure to them. In some cases, especially in nature, these laws function automatically. The work of gravity, the orbits of the planets, and the metamorphosis of a butterfly are good examples. In other cases, especially in moral, spiritual, or cultural affairs, people must discover these laws and obey them. This is certainly true in marriage and family life. The proper operation of a church or a business or an enterprise or a school also depends on discovering and obeying the laws that govern them. God has built into the world certain not only physical, but also moral and spiritual and cultural laws or principles that if we learn to recognize them, will allow us to live life more successfully and bring us success and happiness. The book of Proverbs will talk about these things in some detail. So not only does God exist, but creation is designed by God's wisdom and is subject to his laws. But a third thing I'd like to talk about is that as creation reveals God, it provokes us humans to worship God. You have this mention in places like Psalm 19 and Romans chapter 1. In Psalm 19:1, the heavens declare the glory of God and the firmaments declare his handiwork. And so we see the existence of God, but it goes on to encourage us to worship God as we see his glory. And then in Romans chapter 1, 19 through 20, it not only indicates that creation shows that God exists, but again, it encourages us to praise God and worship the Creator rather than creation because of that fact. And in various places in the Bible, it'll bring out the need to worship our Creator. You're worthy, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created. Revelation chapter 4 and verse 11. Jack Cottrell puts it this way. He says that creation itself makes God worthy of worship. When we consider the awesomeness of creation from nothing, what other response could we possibly make? By the word of the Lord, the heavens were made. Let the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him. For he spoke and it was done. He commanded and it stood fast. Quoting from Psalm 33, 6 through 9. Or, come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker. Psalm 95 and verse 6. And Cottrell goes on to say that Paul says that only fools worship and serve creatures rather than the Creator. Romans 1, verses 20 through to 25. As we look at the awesomeness of creation, it should move us to worship the Creator. But before we leave Genesis chapter 1, I'd like to make one other major point, and that's the fact that in the creation account, that creation culminates in the creation of mankind in God's image. A distinctive teaching of the biblical worldview is that human beings are made in the image of God. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky and over the livestock and all the wild animals and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Now, does being made in the image of God mean that we look like God? Well, that's a laughable idea. And Mark Twain was kind of a skeptic, and he was quick to make fun of it. He said, I was made merely in the image of God, but not otherwise resembling him enough to be mistaken for him by anybody but a very nearsighted person. The Bible never actually tells us what it means to be made in the image of God. And so theologians are left to speculate as to exactly what the meaning is. But there are several plausible ways of looking at it, and let me mention some of those. One possible way of looking at the image of God in man is not that we look like God physically, but we share with God certain mental and spiritual qualities that make humans in some ways like God. We have reason, we have personality, emotions, free will, self-consciousness, intelligence, creativity, the ability to make moral choices, the ability to relate to God. We have a spiritual nature, and the ability to communicate with speech. In all of these ways, we are like God, and we are different than the animals, at least in terms of degree. We have much more reason and much more free will and self-consciousness than the animal world does, and much more complex speech communications. And so one way of looking at the image of God is that we share mental and spiritual qualities with God, and that makes sense. But another way that we may resemble God was suggested by Karl Barth, famous neo-Orthodox theologian. And he argued that relationships themselves make humans like God. He pointed that verse in Genesis 1:26, let us make man in our own image, and taking the traditional Christian view, takes the us as a reference to the Trinity. And he reflects on the fact that the triune God has existed from eternity past as Father, Son, and Spirit, and they have the three persons of the Godhead have related to one another from eternity past, so that God didn't need to create mankind in order to have some person to relate to, because God within himself has personal relationships, as it were. And so humans made in God's image are similar to God in that we relate to one another in terms of relationships, as symbolized by marriage. In other words, man does not exist as a solitary creature, but as two persons confronting each other. And this relates to being made in the image of God, and uses man as male and female as the point of pointing out that this relationship thing is inherent as to being part of the image of God. A third approach to the image of God has to do with the dominion over nature. And some have argued this way that, well, the Bible doesn't actually define what it means to be made in God's image, but we can at least see a functional definition. Because we're made in God's image, we are given dominion over nature. As God said in Genesis 1:28, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Now, part of this goes back to practices at the time that Genesis was written. In the ancient Near East, kings would often leave behind an image or a statue of themselves after they conquered a territory to say that they were still in charge there. And so God, having created the world, leaves mankind behind for that purpose of indicating his dominion over that territory. Under God as king, God permits man to rule as his representative on earth, as his viceroy, as it were. A viceroy is like a vice king. And so man has a mediating position between God and the animals. We're under God, but we're over the animals as God's representative. And so dominion over nature may be what constitutes our being made in the image of God. Now, you might ask the question, which of these interpretations is right about being made in God's image? And for my part, I would argue that perhaps all of them are right. That is, being made in God's image means that we share certain characteristics with God, which is one of which is our being relational beings. And because of our special characteristics that we share with God that allows us to relate to God in a special way, we have been given responsibility over the rest of creation as God's representatives. So we are in the hierarchy of creation. God is at the top of that hierarchy. Man is below God, and actually in Psalm 8, quoted in Hebrews, it also mentions that man is below the angels. We've been made a little while lower than the angels, or another translation is lower than God, and given dominion over the other creatures. And the Bible reflects on that in Psalm 8, where it talks about our dominion over the other animals. Now, when you think about this being made in the image of God, it says something about how we are to treat people. Because we are made in the image of God, there's something great about all human beings. Because all human beings, no matter how flawed they may be or even depraved they may be, while such things may mar God's image in them, it doesn't ever eliminate it. All people are made in God's image, male and female, and we should respect the dignity of every human being because of the fact that all of them are reflecting something about God. They're made in the image of God. Now, this doctrine of the image of God is a basis for the Bible condemning murder as such a heinous act. It says in Genesis 9 and verse 6, whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made mankind. In other words, when you attack a human being, kill a human being, you are to be punished severely, since an attack on a human being is indirectly an attack on God, in whose image human beings are made. Now, this is in stark contrast with atheistic materialism again. Atheistic materialism really has no philosophical basis for seeing human dignity. They have no philosophical basis for seeing mankind as greatly different than mere animals. We may be a little more developed in some ways than other animals, but we're all just basically animals and the like. And why should a product of an impersonal evolution have any inherent dignity? But the Christian worldview says that humans do have a dignity because they're made in God's image, and that humans are categorically above the other animals, and that's why we're given dominion over them, because God made us in a special way. The culmination of creation, he made us in his own image, unlike all other creatures. Now, this can, again, affect even the way that we view things like elective abortion and euthanasia at the end of life. In a secular worldview, a fetus is just a clump of tissue. And, if the fetus happens to be inconvenient for our conveniences, you can get rid of it, easily enough. An old person, when they start getting sick, can be looked at as a burden on society and should be encouraged, if not forced, to accept assisted suicide to get out of the way. More and more in a number of countries, Canada and England and some of the European countries, euthanasia, encouraging people to do assisted suicide, is becoming more common, and indeed it's viewed as an economic advantage because it saves money on the healthcare system, which is coming under a great deal of stress. But to Christians, that lump of tissue in a mother's womb is a developing human being made in the image of God. And even an old person is a person of worth as God's image bearer. And one should not take human life arbitrarily, as Francis Schaeffer put it 40 years ago. He said on human dignity, "But the dignity of human life is unbreakably linked to the existence of the personal infinite God. It is because there is a personal infinite God who has made men and women in his own image that they have a unique dignity of life as human beings. Human life, then, is filled with dignity. The state and humanistically oriented law have no right and no authority to take human life arbitrarily the way it is being taken." That's talking about abortion and euthanasia. Now, another aspect of this image of God and having dominion over nature is that it gives us a basis for, you might call, a Christian environmentalism. In Psalm 8, it reflects on Genesis 1, that you have made man, or human beings, little lower than the angels and crowned them with glory and honor. You made them rulers over the works of your hands and put everything under their feet, all flocks and herds and animals of the wild, the birds in the sky and the fish in the sea, all that swim in the paths of the sea. And it talks about how majestic God's name is, in part because of his making man so great and giving him this honor. Now, Psalm 8 says that mankind has been given stewardship over creation as God's, well, by implication, as God's image bearers. And that means we should not destroy the environment, but we should care for it and maintain it because we are God's stewards of creation. We should do a good job. Now, unlike more radical environmentalists who say, well, we should never turn a wilderness into a garden, well, it is okay to turn a wilderness into a garden. That's what happened in the Garden of Eden, actually. And likewise, it's okay to mitigate the destructive aspects of nature, to tame it at times. Nature is not always a good thing. There's earthquakes and floods and tsunamis and pests. And so you shouldn't always just leave nature alone. We can use, for example, insecticides to suppress malaria-conveying mosquitoes. The important thing is that whatever we do, that the benefits outweigh any damage that might be done to creation. But the bottom line is that we are to care for creation. It's one of our purposes that God has given to us as human beings. And in doing so, we should not worship nature the way certain people have done, but rather should worship the God who created nature. So what does Genesis 1 teach us about God and the Christian worldview? Among the things that it teaches us is that there is a triune, infinite, personal, all-wise God who created us. And it teaches us that we humans have meaning and dignity by virtue of being made in God's image. And as a result, we should treat all human beings with dignity and not destroy human life arbitrarily. It shows us that God designed the world, the physical world, the moral world, and even the spiritual and cultural world by his wisdom, and that human success and happiness comes by living life in accordance with the wisdom and moral principles that God used in creating the world. And we can also find purpose and meaning in life by worshiping, obeying, and enjoying the Creator God who made us. The Westminster Catechism put it this way: what is the chief end of man? Was the first question of the Shorter Catechism. And the answer is, man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. When we look at Genesis chapter 1 and the Christian worldview, which it begins to unfold for us, it will give us a basis for how we can look at life, how we can live life as Christians, and how we can enjoy life by enjoying and worshiping our Creator. And that's the lesson of Genesis chapter 1. And my name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle.